The present indicative portrays the action in progress and usually at the present time, but there are some exceptions to this. The present indicative may be used to portray an action as in progress or in process. This is called a descriptive or progressive present. Here in these two verses, Matthew 8:24 and 25, we have a few words highlighted here for us because the underlying Greek verbs are in the present tense. And we're not going to look at each one of these, just going to focus in on this English verb here, perishing, which is translated from the Greek verb apolumetha. Now, the descriptive present or progressive present is quite common in the New Testament. This is a common use of the present. And I want to focus in on two characteristics of this use. The first characteristic is the verbal action is happening in the right now of the speaker. So, for example, we have the disciples here. They went and woke him, saying, "Save us, Lord, we are perishing." So you can see that this verbal action is happening in the present from the viewpoint of the speakers. The second characteristic of this use of the present is that the verbal action is portrayed as unfolding or in progress. This is in contrast to the verbal action being repeated, as in they were perishing over and over and over. Instead, this verbal action is seen as being in progress. And let's take a look at just one more illustration. Now in this example, Hebrews 13:14, just want to focus in on one verb here that is in the present tense. That is the word epizetumen, which is translated seek here in this verse. And the same two characteristics that we talked about in the previous video apply to this. Here we're looking at a continual action because remember in the present tense form we're thinking of kind of action before the time of action. So here we have a continual action here, but also this action is happening in the right now from the perspective of the author. And this kind of action is significant in the context of Hebrews because the people to whom this letter is written are considered to be a community in or around Rome. And if you think about Rome within the empire, it is the city. And in this verse, the author writes, "For here we have no lasting city, but we seek the city that is to come." The present indicative is used to describe a past event vividly. We do the same thing in English when we tell a story. For example, I was driving down the street when all of a sudden, a deer jumps out in front of me. Notice that the event is past time, but I use a present tense verb, jumps, instead of jumped, to describe the action of the deer. This is called the historical present. Here we are in Matthew chapter 4, verses 7 through 10, where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness by Satan. And here we have several verbs highlighted for us because the underlying Greek verbs are in the present tense. Now when I say present, it can cause a bit of confusion because in English, when we think of tense, it refers to time. And when we think of present tense, we think of words like maybe I take or I am taking or I show or I am showing. But here we have present tense underlying these English verbs, and yet they're still translated as though they're past time. This just goes to show you that the present tense in Greek functions a bit different than the present tense in English. Here what we have is present tense verbs being used in past time. Now normally in narrative, and this happens only in narrative, we would expect the aorist tense because we're talking about events that happen in past time. Now keep in mind that the time of the action is secondary to the kind of action that's involved. So typically in narrative we would expect to see the aorist tense, something expressing past time. So what's the present tense doing here? Well, because it seems to be a little bit out of place, it's drawing our attention to the actions that are happening in this passage. And it fits the context well because this is a significant point in Jesus' ministry. The use of the present tense in narrative can describe a past event vividly or draw our attention to certain actions in a passage. Here in Matthew 17:1, we have two more examples of the historical present, as indicated by the darker shade of blue highlighting, because the underlying Greek verbs are in the present tense. Now, I've already made the point that in Greek, the time of action is secondary to the kind of action. Now, even though that may be the case, time still plays some role in tense. So now, because we're in narrative, and because these events occur in past time, we would expect to see the aorist. But instead, in this verse, we have the present tense. And as before, the use of this tense is somewhat out of place. And so what it does is it draws our attention to the actions in this passage. That Jesus took Peter and James and his brother John and led them up a high mountain by themselves. And in and of itself, that verse might not seem that significant. But what follows in the rest of the verses is very significant, that Jesus is transfigured before them. So the key questions to ask here when working with the present tense is, would we expect the aorist here? Are we in narrative? Do these events occur in past time? Or perhaps one of the most obvious one is this verb in the present tense, and is it translated into English as though it's in past time? If you can answer yes to that last question, you might want to look at the surrounding context to see if the author is drawing your attention to a specific action or event. Now, I would say if you're using this in a sermon, you probably don't want to get into the whole jargon about historical present and present tense and explaining the system of Greek and English. But that doesn't mean that you can't tell this story vividly or that you can't draw the attention of your audience to the events and actions in this passage. The present indicative is used to express general or timeless truths. This is called a proverbial or gnomic present. Here in Matthew 7:17, we have two verbs here highlighted for us because the underlying Greek verbs are in the present tense. And here in this context, Jesus is speaking a general or timeless truth. The present tense here in this context doesn't indicate that something is happening right now or that something is happening over and over. Rather, the present tense is indicating that something does happen. In this instance, it's a general observation that a healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. Now, very often, when verbs are used in this way, you'll find connected to them a subject that is very general or generic.